The avoidant always assumes they hold the upper hand. They believe their distance confuses you. They think their mixed signals keep you guessing. They assume their emotional coldness makes you chase. In their mind, your softness means you're naive. Your empathy means you don't see what's happening. Your patience means you don't understand the dynamic. They rely on that belief. It's part of how they feel safe. They tell themselves you are the emotional one, the fragile one, the one who loves too blindly to see clearly. But this is the first and biggest mistake they make, because your softness was never naivety. It was emotional intelligence. It was intuition. It was observation disguised as kindness. Avoidants misread emotional maturity as vulnerability. They mistake understanding for ignorance. They look at you being gentle, forgiving, patient, and open-hearted, and they assume you don't know what they're doing. They don't understand that empaths read people differently. You don't need them to explain their behavior for you to understand it. You can feel the shift in their energy before they even make a move. You notice the pauses in their tone. You sense the changes in their emotional distance. When an avoidant pulls back, you feel the fear underneath it long before they do. When they act indifferent, you sense the longing hiding in their silence. When they pretend not to care, you feel the conflict burning inside them. You weren't naive. You were tuned in. You were seeing the entire emotional picture while they were busy trying to hide it. The avoidant thinks they're unreadable because they've spent their whole life building emotional walls. But what they never consider is that empaths don't need the walls to come down to see inside someone. You see through tone, through body language, through instinct, through subtle inconsistencies, through the heaviness behind their avoidance. And because you're compassionate, you didn't expose them. You didn't confront them harshly. You didn't force them to open up. You observed quietly. You watched the patterns. You learned their emotional triggers. You understood their wounds even when they denied having any. Your softness wasn't weakness. It was awareness. And because you didn't fight them, they assumed you didn't notice anything. Because you didn't pressure them, they believed you were clueless. Because you gave them space, they believed you were waiting blindly. And because you loved without conditions, they assumed you didn't understand boundaries. This is where their arrogance blinded them. They thought they were emotionally superior. They thought they were the ones observing you. They thought they had all the power because they controlled the distance. But you were seeing everything while they saw nothing. You saw the insecurity behind their pride. You saw the fear behind their silence. You saw the attachment behind their detachment. You saw the love behind their avoidance. Avoidants mistake emotional restraint for emotional mastery. They think because they hide their feelings don't leak out. But to an empath, their behavior was never a mystery. You knew why they pulled away. You knew why they got overwhelmed. You knew why they shut down during emotional closeness. You knew why they suddenly changed the tone of conversations. You knew why they panicked whenever the connection deepened. You weren't confused, you were watching the entire time. And the avoidant only realizes this when you stop reacting the way they expect. When you stop chasing. When you stop explaining. When you stop giving unlimited empathy. When you stop accepting their behavior. When you go quiet with clarity instead of confusion. That's the moment they finally understand you were never the naive one. You were awake from the beginning. You were observing everything while they believed they were invisible. Your softness wasn't a lack of awareness. It was the grace of someone who saw the whole truth and still chose to love. And once they realize that, their entire sense of control shatters. Because the person they underestimated is the one who understood them the deepest. There is a very specific moment in every avoidant-empath dynamic when something inside the avoidant shifts sharply, painfully, undeniably. It's the moment they realize you weren't confused at all. You weren't lost. You weren't guessing. You weren't misreading their behavior. You saw every single thing they thought they were hiding. And that realization hits them harder than any confrontation, any argument, or any emotional breakdown ever could. Avoidants believe their emotional world is invisible. They think nobody can see their fear when they pull away. They think nobody notices their uncertainty when they go silent. They think their shutdowns look like indifference. They think their mixed signals look like emotional control. They assume you only see their actions, never their motives. But empaths don't operate like the average person. You don't wait for someone to explain themselves. You feel the truth long before they're ready to speak it. And that's the part the avoidant never understood until it was too late. You saw their fear of intimacy every time they suddenly needed space after a moment of closeness. You saw their longing every time they disappeared but stayed connected in subtle ways. Watching your stories, checking your online status, orbiting your life quietly. You saw their insecurities every time they became distant and defensive when things felt too real. You saw the tenderness behind their hardened posture. You saw the vulnerability in their eyes when their words tried to push you away. You saw the contradiction in their silence, the heavy kind of silence that only happens when someone feels deeply but is terrified to show it. Avoidants misjudge everything because they assume people perceive emotions the way they do, through logic, distance, and control. They never consider that your heart is more observant than their mind. They don't understand that empathy doesn't need permission to read people. You weren't decoding them. You were simply recognizing what was right in front of you. Their emotional transparency was invisible only to them, and the moment they realized you knew, that you saw the fear they pretended was confidence, the coldness they pretended was strength, the withdrawal they pretended was independence, something inside them collapses. They feel exposed in a way they were never prepared for. Because you didn't just see their behavior, you saw the part of themselves they've been hiding from the entire world since childhood, their wounds. That's the realization that terrifies them. They thought they were masking their avoidance, but you saw how overwhelmed they got by closeness. They thought they were hiding their fear of abandonment, but you felt it in their hesitation. They thought they were covering their emotional panic, but you recognized it instantly. They thought they could keep you at a distance, but you read the love they kept trying to bury. What breaks them is not that you saw their patterns. It's that you saw their truth. The truth they've spent their whole life running from. The truth they weren't ready to face. The truth they tried to protect with distant silence and shutdowns. This realization hits hardest when you finally go quiet. Not confused quiet. Not hurt quiet. Not waiting quiet. But very aware quiet. The silence of someone who knows exactly what's happening and refuses to keep participating in a dynamic they now fully understand. When you stop reacting, stop chasing, stop questioning, they suddenly understand that you weren't naive. You were simply letting them show you who they were. Avoidants crumble internally when they realize the person they thought they were outmaneuvering actually saw them more clearly than they've ever seen themselves. They realize the emotional power they thought they had wasn't power at all. It was projection. And the person they underestimated, the person they assumed didn't understand, the person they believed they could push and pull at will, was quietly understanding them the entire time. It's not your silence that scares them. It's what your silence reveals. That you saw everything. And now they know you did. There is a kind of power that doesn't shout, doesn't confront, doesn't threaten, and doesn't demand. It is the power of quiet awareness. The kind that simply watches, understands, and refuses to be shaken. And this is the power the empath holds without even trying. When the avoidant finally realizes that your quiet observation held more strength than any emotional outburst, something inside them breaks in a way they never expected. Avoidants operate under the belief that the person who reacts the most is the one who cares the most, and therefore the one with less control. They think the one who tries to explain, fix, or understand is the one who is emotionally weaker. So when you didn't yell, didn't beg, didn't chase, didn't unravel, they assumed you didn't fully grasp what was happening. They assumed your silence was uncertainty. They assumed your calmness was confusion. They assumed your patience came from desperation. They completely misread you. Because empaths don't react loudly, they understand deeply. While they were pulling away, you weren't panicking. You were observing the pattern. While they were creating distance, you weren't breaking. You were watching them reveal themselves. While they were playing emotional hide and seek, you weren't chasing. You were learning their wounds, their defenses, their triggers, their fear. This is what avoidants never expect. Your quietness was not helplessness. It was clarity. You weren't trying to control the situation, you were understanding it. And the more they withdrew, the more they exposed exactly what you needed to see. Your lack of reaction was never ignorance. It was mastery. You understood the dynamics long before they did. You knew why they pulled back. You sensed when fear took over. You saw the moment their emotions overwhelmed them. You watched them struggle between wanting closeness and fearing it. You recognized the patterns they didn't even recognize in themselves. And it wasn't that you tolerated everything. It's that you understood everything. You understood that their coldness was self-protection. You understood that their silence was panic. You understood that their distance was fear, not rejection. You understood their emotional shutdowns before they even knew what triggered them. And this is the part that hits the avoidant the hardest. You didn't call them out. You didn't expose their fear. You didn't make them feel small. You just watched. You let them reveal themselves at their own pace. You let them show you their coping mechanisms without interference. You stayed calm while they were emotionally disorganized. You stayed present while they were shutting down. You stayed aware while they were pretending not to feel. Your quietness was not passivity, it was strength. Your stillness was not weakness, it was emotional intelligence. Your silence was not defeat, it was discernment. Avoidants crumble when they realize that the one thing they misinterpreted, your gentle approach, was actually the clearest sign that you understood everything. You didn't need to react because you weren't confused. You didn't need to chase because you weren't trying to force clarity. You didn't need to demand answers because you already saw the truth. And here's the part they never saw coming: your silence was the loudest message you ever sent. It was the moment you stepped out of the dynamic instead of trying to fix it. It was the moment you chose peace over chaos, awareness over explanation, boundaries over emotional exhaustion. When the avoidant finally realizes that your quiet observation was power, not naivety, they feel the full weight of their own misjudgment. Because now they understand that you weren't behind them emotionally, you were ahead of them the entire time. You were never reacting, you were reading. You were never confused, you were awake. You were never naive. You were quietly knowing. And that truth, once it hits them, is something they can never unsee. The avoidant never expects your silence to change. In their mind, silence has always meant the same thing: you're hurt, you're confused, you're overwhelmed, or you're waiting for them to come back. They believe silence is temporary. They believe silence is emotional fog. They believe silence means you're still in the cycle. After all, every silence before this one ended with you reaching out, understanding, forgiving, explaining. But then something shifts, not loudly, not dramatically, not with a final conversation, but through a quiet, unmistakable change in your energy. Your silence stops being emotional and becomes intentional. It stops being reactionary and becomes decisive. It stops being soft and becomes solid. And that shift is what collapses the avoidant's sense of control. Avoidants think they understand silence. They use silence as protection. They use silence as distance. They use silence as emotional armor. But they only know one kind of silence, the kind that waits, the kind that aches, the kind that still hopes. They do not know what to do with silence that has moved on, silence that is grounded, silence that is no longer seeking answers or reconciliation. When your silence changes from, "I don't know what to say," to, "I don't need to say anything," they feel it instantly, even if they pretend they don't. Avoidants feel shifts in energy more than shifts in words, because energy is what they've been reacting to their entire lives. When your silence becomes rooted in self-respect instead of heartbreak, it sends a message they cannot run from. The dynamic has changed and they are no longer in control of it. At first, they try to reassure themselves that nothing is different. They convince themselves you're processing, cooling down, doing what you always do, waiting for the right moment to reconnect. They tell themselves the silence is temporary, because it always has been. But underneath that denial is a tremor they don't acknowledge. They sense something they can't articulate. Your silence feels heavier, sharper, cleaner. It no longer feels like the silence of someone who is hurting. It feels like the silence of someone who is done. This is the moment their emotional system begins to destabilize. Avoidants rely on your emotional consistency like oxygen. They need to know you will always be there, even if they pretend they don't want you there. They need your softness. They need your understanding. They need your patience. They need your reassurance, even if their ego won't let them admit it. But now they feel the absence of that energy. Your silence is no longer warm. It's neutral. No longer receptive. It's resolved. No longer hopeful. It's closed. And that emotional neutrality is what breaks them. Avoidants can handle anger. They can handle tears. They can handle confusion. But they cannot handle emotional neutrality because it means they have no influence left. Your silence becomes a mirror reflecting their own behavior back at them. And for the first time, they see the reality they were avoiding. You didn't stop speaking because you were overwhelmed. You stopped speaking because you understood them. You understood the pattern. You understood the dynamic. You understood your own worth. And you finally realized you didn't have to keep explaining yourself to someone who wasn't listening. This is where the collapse begins. Not with your absence, but with the meaning behind your absence. They realize you are no longer waiting for their return. You are no longer bending toward their fear. You are no longer offering unlimited patience. And when they feel that shift, panic rises beneath their calm exterior. Because if you're no longer reaching out, no longer reacting, no longer trying, then the emotional safety they built their avoidance upon is gone. The power they thought they had dissolves in an instant. The moment your silence becomes clarity, their illusion of control collapses. They finally see that the person they believed they could push away forever was actually the one grounding the entire connection. And without your emotional presence, they are left alone with the consequences of their own fear. They don't collapse because you left. They collapse because your silence reveals you don't need them anymore in the way they always assumed you did. There is a moment avoidants are never prepared for. The moment they realize you understood them more deeply, more accurately, and more compassionately than anyone ever has. Not because they told you, not because they opened up, not because they explained their wounds, but because you felt them, because you sensed what they were too afraid to say, because you read the emotional truth behind every shutdown, every withdrawal, every hesitation, every contradiction. And when that realization hits them, it shakes something inside them that has been locked for years. Avoidants spend their lives hiding their fear of intimacy, hiding their fear of abandonment, hiding the wounds that shape their defenses, hiding the fragility they mask with distance. They never expect anyone to see beneath the surface because they've never let anyone close enough to try. But you didn't need permission. You didn't need an invitation. You understood them instinctively, intuitively, emotionally. You saw through their silence not because they revealed anything, but because their energy spoke in ways their words never could. When they realize you saw who they were not who they pretended to be, everything changes. Avoidants fear being seen more than anything. They believe that once someone sees their mess, their trauma, their fear, their inability to handle closeness, that person will leave. So they stay one step away at all times. Never too close, never too open. But then comes the shock. You already saw all of it long before their defenses tried to hide it. And instead of leaving, you loved them. Instead of judging, you accepted them. Instead of pushing for more, you honored their pace. Instead of exposing their wounds, you simply held space for them. This is why avoidants struggle so much when they finally understand the depth of your perception. They realize you didn't misunderstand them. You understood them better than they understood themselves. You saw the child inside them who fearfully learned to pull away. You saw the adult who still carries that instinct. You saw the internal conflict they denied. You saw the care they couldn't express. You saw the attachment they couldn't admit. You saw their heart even when they were convinced it was hidden. And suddenly they feel naked in a way that terrifies them. Because if you saw everything they worked so hard to hide, then you also saw every moment they failed to show up for you. You saw every time they let fear win. You saw every opportunity they had to choose connection but didn't. You saw the love they felt but refused to express. You saw the loyalty they wanted to offer but couldn't. You saw the tears behind the distance, the longing behind the silence, the softness behind the walls. To be seen is one thing. To be seen accurately is another. But to be seen with compassion, that is the rarest experience an avoidant ever has. This is what shakes them, the realization that you didn't misjudge them. You understood them exactly. And your understanding was never weaponized. You didn't throw their flaws in their face. You didn't shame their fear. You didn't demand they change. You simply held the truth quietly within you. And now, when your energy shifts, when you become silent, self-respecting, steady, they finally understand the magnitude of what they lost. They lost the one person who didn't misunderstand their distance. They lost the one person who saw their fear but didn't run. They lost the one person who recognized their emotional limitations and still treated them gently. They lost the one person who understood them better than they've ever been understood. Avoidants collapse when they realize the empath didn't fall for the illusion. The empath saw the truth. And now that the truth has shifted, now that you no longer offer that unconditional understanding, they face a kind of emotional exposure they've spent their entire life avoiding. They realize too late that being understood by you is not a weakness. It was the safest thing they ever had. There is a moment in every avoidance journey where the truth hits them so hard it pulls the air out of their chest. The moment they realize you were never the fragile one, never the dependent one, never the emotionally overwhelmed one. You were the one holding all the truth from the beginning. And that realization doesn't just surprise them, it destabilizes them. Because for the first time, they see the roles clearly. They weren't protecting themselves from you. They were running from the only person who truly understood them. And you weren't clinging to a fantasy. You were observing reality with a clarity they never possessed. Avoidants build their identity around control. Emotional control, psychological control, relational control. They need to feel like the one who pulls back, the one who decides the pace, the one who decides when things get close and when things shut down. They interpret your softness as dependency and your patience as vulnerability. They live in the belief that you need them more than they need you. That belief is the foundation of their emotional safety. But then everything turns. Not because you fought, not because you begged, not because you forced anything, but because you quietly stepped into your truth, and your truth was stronger than their fear. They begin to replay everything with new eyes. Every moment you tried to understand them instead of reacting. Every time you held space for their confusion without collapsing. Every time you showed emotional maturity while they were shutting down. Every time you observed instead of over-explaining. They realize you weren't lost, you were patient. You weren't overwhelmed, you were discerning. You weren't confused, you were compassionate. And suddenly, the avoidant sees that the emotional power in this connection was never theirs. It was always yours. This realization shakes them because it exposes something they never want to admit. They were the one emotionally behind. They were the one who didn't understand the connection. They were the one who panicked. They were the one drowning in fear while you stayed steady. And when your silence finally arrives, not emotional silence, but resolved silence, they feel the shift in their bones. Your silence doesn't ask for them. Your silence doesn't wait for them. Your silence doesn't chase them. Your silence doesn't soften for them. Your silence doesn't collapse beneath them. Your silence becomes a boundary, not a wound. And that's when they see the truth clearly for the first time. You were never the dependent one. You were the one with emotional depth, self-awareness, intuition, and strength. You were the one capable of connection. You were the one capable of staying centered in chaos. You were the one capable of seeing the whole picture. They were the one operating on fear. They were the one reacting from old wounds. They were the one overwhelmed by intimacy. They were the one running from themselves. And the moment they recognized this reversal of emotional roles, the moment they realized that you were the grounded one from the beginning, something collapses internally. They lose the illusion of control they clung to. They lose the narrative that kept them safe. They lose the image of themselves as the emotionally strong one. And they lose the assumption that you would always be there, waiting, understanding, and forgiving. Avoidants don't collapse because you left them. They collapse because your truth reveals the reality they ran from. You weren't naive. You were aware. You weren't fragile. You were wise. You weren't dependent. You were selective. You weren't chasing. You were choosing. And now, the person they believed they could pull away from is the same person who was holding more emotional power, more clarity, and more truth than they ever imagined. They realized too late that they never had the upper hand. They were just too afraid to see who you truly were. Your strength was quiet, but it was real. Your insight was gentle, but it was deep. Your love was soft, but it was intentional. And your silence, in the end, revealed everything they refused to face. That is the moment they finally understand the person they underestimated was the one who saw them most clearly.